Well, I'm here with Zak Slayback, who's a friend of mine, someone I last saw in person a couple years ago. We've had him on the radio show about a year ago to talk about his book. He's a principal in the 1517 Fund, which are a group of individuals who are doing some really interesting work in the world of venture capital. So thanks for joining me, Zak.
Thanks for having me on, David.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And wow, it's a wild time in America. It's a unique time. It's a lot of things that we can see patterns of history repeating in front of our eyes. And at the same time, I believe that it's indicative, these events that we're seeing in the headlines, that history is in a trajectory. It's going someplace. And you and I have had conversations in the past about Mimetic Theory. I believe I went on your 1517 podcast a few years ago and talked about it. And we're seeing it all over the headlines today, aren't we?
Right. Yeah, no, you and I were just discussing this, that at the core of a lot of mimetic theories is this idea of mob violence and how to avoid or reduce mob violence. And the thing that scares me right now is there's no obvious scapegoat, right? So like Girard proposes this idea that there needs to be a scapegoat that everyone can kind of view as guilty. So they're actually innocent usually, but everyone can kind of view as guilty to lob everything onto. And it's like, the best I can come up with is maybe the president. I don't know, but I don't like that outcome because that's a very significant figure, and that would be a lot of chaos to throw in.
Right. Well, that's exactly it, is that because of the influence of Christianity, which we'll get into a little bit today on a personal level and on a macro level, we'll see how it all ties together. But, because of the influence of Christianity, our old way of keeping the peace, which is to unconsciously search for a believable scapegoat that we can all truly believe is deserving of being purged and blamed and shamed, no longer suffices to provide order and peace and unity. And so now we're still doing the same scapegoating behavior, but it doesn't result in peace or order or unity. We can't come together and say, yes, this is the person to be blamed, this is the person to be destroyed, and it doesn't create unity. The closest we got to in recent history was Osama bin Laden here in America.
Right.
But that didn't last long either, because obviously a significant portion of Americans don't even believe Osama bin Laden was involved in the attacks of 9/11. So even that scapegoat, which was as close as we could get to a believable coming together around the destruction of a common enemy, folks don't even agree with that. And that was the last shot we had at a unifying scapegoat. And scapegoats, by the way, don't mean they're innocent. I want to make sure we understand that. We're not saying that a scapegoat can be guilty of the things they're being accused of.
Right.
They're just not, what makes them a scapegoat is that they're a unifying force that everybody finds meaning by excluding.
Okay? Right. And Girard just notes in a lot of the literature that throughout history, they tend to be innocent because that's the easiest way for people to unify around them, but there are actually guilty scapegoats. Yeah, I was having this conversation with a friend the other day that I think our culture has developed a lot of like vicarious scapegoating as a way, especially like as the culture secularizes, as a way of kind of getting this effect, whether that's in with celebrities and just culture in general, more recently in like cancel culture, and sports. But sports participation and viewership has been on the decline for years. Participation in popular culture has actually been fairly heavily on the decline for a number of years. The closest thing that's kind of come up has been cancel culture, which is really dangerous. And then obviously like the actual institution, we had a workshop recently in 1517 where we brought on a finance expert who also studies Girard. And somebody asked him, well, how do we actually escape the scapegoating process? How do we escape the cycle of like mimetic desire and violence? And he kind of laughed and he's like, well, if you ask Girard, it's, become a devout practicing Christian. But as society becomes more and more secularized, it's hard to find substitutes for that. And the substitutes just are not going to be as good. And I think that's part of what we're seeing today. I just wrote a book review on Michelle Houellebecq's new book, Serotonin, where I talk a little bit about this, that it should be no surprise that we're getting riots across the country. It should be no surprise that we're getting the level of discontent we see on social media. When you understand that people, not only do they not have their scapegoats anymore, but they also are like entirely rootless in the world. They don't have families. They don't have a God. They don't have a community. All that stuff has been taken from them. All that stuff has been, that they've I don't even want to say taken from them, because it's almost too much of a victim mentality, but they have assented to these things being given away. And of course, it's going to lead to a lot of unhappiness and discomfort in the world.
Yeah, and it's something that I believe Jesus kind of predicted would happen if societies become infected with his story, but yet don't want to renounce their proclivity to the prerogative to shame shifting and violence. So,
Yeah.
you know, he talks about the idea that I've come to bring a sword, right? And the sword's going to cut through daughter against mother and brother against brother and father against mother-in-law and all that. That he didn't need to do that. That was always there, I guess. But the idea is that, you know, it's the idea that what used to bind us together will no longer be a source of peace if a society has the story of Christianity, the story of the crucified one, the story of the ultimate good being found in a victim, a misfit sent on the ash heap of his own town, out in the trash, the Golgotha Hill. This idea that this story would infect the imaginations of communities that engage it. And then if they don't renounce their violence, but they still have that infection, you're going to get the loss of rootedness that you're describing, because people are going to destroy their institutions,
right,
because they're haunted by the cross.
Right.
So they're going to attack the institutions wherever they see oppression. But then because they don't have that mercy ethic that comes with renouncing and repentance, right? Because they don't have that mercy ethic grounding their exposure to the Christian aesthetic in their stories, in their institutions, they're going to scramble and tear up the whole thing. And that's what
absolutely.
we're seeing here.
And I think if you add on top of that the formula of liberalism as its own religion, and I don't mean that like liberalism necessarily as a pejorative that would have been used maybe 10 years ago on talk radio. I mean more like classical liberalism, or liberalism qua the French Revolution. That has its own religious element to it. It still has these religious institutions. I was having a conversation with a professor the other day about this, that riots are the liberal mass. In the same way that the mass is the height of the Christian spiritual life and has four specific ends, the riot is the height of the liberal liturgical life, the liberal spiritual life. The liberal society is born in riots, and it lives itself out in riots. You add on top of that the dangers of private interpretation too, where anyone gets to define concepts like freedom however they see fit. They don't have to tie it back to this idea of like a common good, and a common good that fundamentally is rooted in like man's fundamental purpose in the world. You're going to get so many disagreements, and you're going to get exactly what we have going on today. You're going to get people arguing over, well, they all think they're arguing for some definition of freedom. But at the end of the day, there's nothing fundamental that they can all appeal to. So yeah, you absolutely have this guilt of the Christian society without the redemption, without the mercy. And I don't think it's a surprise at all that we end up with mass rioting.
And I've also described the riots or the looting that we see on the streets as the result of failed sacrifices. Someone was pointing out the other day about the New York City riots about the Vietnam War. And I was thinking to myself, it's like, yeah, I mean, why would a war result in people running into the streets, stealing and breaking things and all that? And I was like, well, it's clear if you think about it from an anthropological level that the war is an attempt at a sacrificial ritual to send our young men and women to go off, or young men mostly, I guess, in Vietnam, to go off into harm's way to fight off a foreign boogeyman, a foreign Grendel, if you will. You got Beowulf. We're going off to fight Grendel in Vietnam. Here we go. Sacrifice your children for this. And what happens? It doesn't. It's not a believable. It's not a sufficient sacrifice, and so the community rejects it, and it spills violence into the streets as a form of undifferentiated chaos, because the sacrifice is not accepted as a unifying, believable ritual. And the same thing happens with George Floyd. George Floyd, is a victim of a sacrificial ritual. Arresting a man using the kind of brutal force that the state can employ with qualified immunity, and this doctrine that's been created. And this ritual of you put on a badge and then you can put your knee on someone's neck in front of a camera, and that's not a thing. I mean, that's a ritual. That's a ritual that we've allowed to be a thing. And so it's a sacrificial ritual. And guess what? We see the camera and the public says, I do not accept that sacrificial ritual. And what does that result in? Undifferentiated chaos. Everybody with masks, and they're burning things. They're beating up minority businesses, destroying so you don't know who's who. And then over here in Florida, there was a Saigon restaurant right across the street from the university I used to go to that was burned to a crisp. And I was like, I asked the leftists, I said, why are you guys doing this? This is what did this Vietnamese family do to you? What did they do to you? And they should have had insurance. They'll be fine.
Right.
And then it was, oh no, this was actually a neo-Nazi group that did this. And then I'm like, well, my goodness, this is a classic case of undifferentiation, where we see this in ancient societies where they would have a monster, and it would be half eagle, half donkey, half lion, half gorilla, like these little monstrous entities of mythology. And you see, well, wait a second, that's what we see here in a more modernistic way. We see this raging fire of energy. And is it some people say it's police that are doing these violent things to get the riots, the protesters destroyed. Some people say it's neo-Nazis. Some people say it's Black Lives Matter. Some people say it's Antifa. Some people say it's deep state. No one knows who it is, because it's a masked ritual.
Right.
And when you have a mass ritual, you have an undifferentiated state of chaos. That's what we're at. This is what we're seeing.
No, absolutely.
So how do we, that's the question, is how do we begin to have a conversation in the public square that can speak into that undifferentiated chaos and try to be a peacemaker? The only thing I can think of is, you can't just hunker down into your own little community. You have to have, somebody can't, most people can, I guess, but for those who do have a voice in the public square, we need to use that voice as a way of peacemaking, and what does that look like? How do you sort that out?
Yeah. And that's the $1 trillion question, right? That's such a difficult question. I have been, since the beginning of 2020, between this and the coronavirus and everything else, this is the first time that I've actually been a little bit seriously concerned about the future, because that's a very complex question. Fundamentally, mob actions like that are like culture. They have their own spontaneous order to them, in the element that they're the product of human action, but not of human design. So there's not any one group you can go to appeal to. There's no easy way of solving this, right? I think it is a lot of ground up individual actions. I wonder about the long term. There's a Cistercian monk I follow. His name is he goes by Potter Edmund. He writes at a blog called the Josias, and he also has his own blog. And he had a good post the other day where he said, it's very easy in this scenario to have a knee-jerk reaction to go to the side of order, right? Because especially if you are terrified of the return of the Jacobins, like I am, it's really, really, really easy to go to the side of order, because the reign of terror that the Jacobins brought in, and the liberal order that came after the French Revolution, has been the bloodiest order that we have ever seen in human history. But that's a knee-jerk reaction fundamentally. What we want to go back to is, we want to ask, how do we actually build a society, right? And I think if you look at the United States today, and really just friend of mine has a theory that there's really only like 1.5 civilizations in the world right now, maybe 2. You have Western civilization, which even Chinese culture is a version of Western civilization. It's, capitalism without the chaos is how they're going to brand it. And then you have like half a civilization, Islamic culture, which still has a lot of like westernized elements to it. But fundamentally, like the soft technologies that underlie almost every institution across the world today are like Western institutions. You have to ask yourself, how do you build societies inside these institutions? The United States is 330 million people that have all been roped into being in the same society with each other, many of whom have nothing in common with each other. So of course they're going to reject the sacrifice they see on TV. Of course they're going to reject the sacrifice they see on Twitter, right? Like, one of the interesting things about, if you look at whether it's the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church, is they have there's many different rites in them, right? There's something like 20-something rites within the Catholic Church. Everyone, if you're not of one of these smaller rites in the United States, you tend to think of Roman Catholicism, but that's just Latin rite. You also have like Maronite Catholics, you have Coptic Catholics, you have Chaldean Catholics, you have Byzantine Catholics, all these different rites, right? And I think there's something to that in the idea that it's much easier for people to identify with the sacrifice and with the group reconciliation if they recognize themselves as being in the same society or the same rite or the same group as other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing about with Christianity is it unleashes this universalistic ethic, which is tied into globalism in some way, right? The idea that Christians claim that God makes the rain to rain for the just and the unjust, and the idea that who are you to be like? Who is what does it mean to be a neighbor to somebody? Someone asked Jesus, and he says it's the guy that you hate. Watch how he he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, who is this this ethnic rival of his own people. When he tells this story, he says, go and be like the guy that you hate. Go and be like the guy that you don't, that the guy that says that your God and his temple and your temple, he's not in there. The very center of your reality, the Samaritan rejects, and yet he has, in this story that Jesus gives, the parable, this Samaritan still acts rightly. He still loves his enemy. And he says, go and be like your enemy who loves you. And that way of disrupting our conventional boundaries about kinship and who's on the in crowd. This collectivist identity politics thing is an attempt to try to create this fusion of universalistic ethics with kinship politics. Everybody's going to get into a group. You have to have whiteness is a social construct, right. And that's going to be the one that gets beaten on like a piñata. And then you have the other groups that have been oppressed, and now they're going to create these kinship groups that then it's like Power Rangers. They all combine to one giant, machine, and they're able to take on the big bad supremacists.
Right. Well, fundamentally, at the end of the day, yes, there is this universalism to the Christian ethic, but there still is a head of it, right? There's still Christ at the head, and then the vicar of Christ at the head of it. So there's still something that everyone can come to and rally around. I think the problem with the identity politics universalism that we see today, whether it's the white supremacist flavor or the woke flavor, is there's no head to it. There's no central concept that is actually a concept that isn't itself just an empty placeholder that people can come and rally around. People will tell you that it's some concept of like freedom or equality, but the fact that I can't even choose one of those phrases tells you that there's no actual central concept there. And that's where you get this conflict. People need something, even if they have their own ways of coming to it through their rights or their societies or what have you, their way of transferring information among the fabric of information that they've grown up in. They still need something fundamentally that they all come around, that they all, in the case of sacrifice, that they all throw their the iniquities on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think there needs to be a place for, Rene Girard would call it an external mediator of desire, and we have a lot of internal mediation, which is why we have constant rivalry and conflict. And you need an external mediator of desire, someone who's a little bit outside of your reach, and that would be Jesus in this case, because Jesus does not, first of all, he doesn't model you back, so he doesn't imitate you, which is where conflict can arise, right? If you start imitating your friend, a lot of times it can go great. I mean, you can be best friends, you can have a bunk bed together, you can brush your teeth in the same sink together, you can do all that for a long time, but that closeness, that proximity of imitational patterns can quickly fly off the handle into a vicious negative cycle too, because of the proximity. But with Jesus, the idea is, you can't reach his level of perfection in the way he exemplifies his life. So you're never going to catch that. But at the same time, he also creates this downward cycle motion that prevents you from seeing him as a model of desire that will instill ego and pride in you. Because, he tells, if you want to be great amongst me, if you want to be great amongst my kingdom, the one who is the oldest should act like he's the youngest. Yeah. Whoever's the greatest should act like they're a servant, like they're a peasant.
Well, this is even the idea.
He's a downward reversal, you see.
This is even the idea of, in Western society, modern Western society, we like to poo-poo the idea of divine right. But like noblesse oblige, I may be pronouncing that. That fundamentally is that Christ-centered concept of you would have a I don't want to call them a ruling class, because that sounds more like someone who works at the New York Times and then says that they're oppressed. But you would have a ruler who would be totally out of reach of everyone, including the aristocrats. And when the breakdown between the ruler and the aristocrats happens, that's when you get the French Revolution kind of stuff, where the aristocrats fund a proletariat revolution that ends up actually killing more people than it could have ever possibly had underneath the ruler. We have a ruler that's separate from everyone else, that everyone knows that they're not going to be part of, because that's a hereditary line. But the ruler simultaneously would give their life for their people. The ruler would give their life for their country and actually bring themselves down to the lowest level if they needed to. But we've totally lost that concept. So instead what we get is it seems to me like our cycles of mimetic violence run at about 2 to 4 year cycles based on election cycles, and they get stronger and stronger every cycle that we go through.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that's it's a debate amongst those who study Rene Girard about how this all, to work this out. And I've noticed that even, conservative and leftist Girardians, they have this way of saying, well, Jesus says renounce violence. And even, Rene Girard said, the only way we're going to survive is to renounce all participation in collective violence. And it's like, yeah, that sounds great, but the devil's in the details. How does that actually look? Because that's the big elephant in the room, that, humanity's spiraling into these problems and they never seem to get solved. And yet the choice is radically simple, according to Rene Girard, and my own reading of the scripture is you have to renounce your prerogative to collective violence. And then again, it becomes kind of murky from there, because then you find out that people start saying, well, yeah, that means basically don't go to like the Iraq war. It's like, that's it? Just don't do that. It's like, is that all you got to do? No, obviously not. And then the left says, don't do collective violence. Therefore, don't lock kids in cages like Trump did. It's like, okay, yeah, that's it. But Obama and all that stuff that he was doing, that's okay. And so it's like, it's always, nobody just wants to just renounce participation in violence. We all say we do when it comes to like, I'm not going to join a mob. That's the easy way, unless you're right next to a mob, but that's a little harder. But but we don't want to renounce violence when it comes to going into, you were talking about rights, about the church. Well, the secular institution of America has a voting right.
Right.
It's a ritual. You go in there, you obfuscate your identity. Nobody knows what you do behind that veil. It's a hidden sacred act. It's a crime to take a photograph of what you did in there. And then you're able to hire people in anonymity to carry out actions that you yourself would never do if you were asked to do it yourself. Like this person says he's going to keep basically the laws on the book, which means, if someone's selling raw milk, they're going to send a man with a gun to tell that man to drop the udder. And it's like, you wouldn't do that yourself. I mean, who in the world would just say, hey, you know what? I'm going up to my farmer. I saw you selling raw milk and that's against the law. So here's a gun. Stop. Put the udder down. Who in the world would do that kind of psychopathic stuff? But if we go into the voting booth, we have this anonymous ritual, this voting right, and then somehow it transfers this magical power that we never would have ever morally had as an individual into this magical ritual with badges and guns and everything, and then therefore it's okay. But you see what I mean? That's just an example of that kind of baked-in collective violence that our system is operating with.
Right, and I am the gigantic disclaimer from the beginning of this conversation is I'm not a theologian, but I think that there is fundamentally like one act of quote unquote violence that everyone can participate in, that has, if they're earnestly participating in it, would have the effect that all the others would fall as a domino effect, and that's the Mass. The Mass is the representation of the sacrifice of the cross. And fundamentally, that is everyone throwing their experiences upon Christ. But to actually participate in it, requires steps like, you have to confess your sins. You have to, fast. You have to be in a place where you are actually desiring to participate in the body and blood and soul and divinity. And to get if a society is at a point where everyone can do that and earnestly do that, I think that would lead to the effect of, non-participation in other forms of violence.
I think so. When Jesus talks about eat my body, the word he uses there, I've heard it translated, is more accurately depicted as like a visceral gnaw.
Chew, it's
chewing.
Something like chew. My body is real food. Chew my body.
Chew.
Right.
So when you think of that word, it does call to mind the origins that Rene Girard points out of human society itself, which was cannibalism, ritual cannibalism. Coming together and sharing a common meal of a sacrificial victim.
Well, you can imagine the line from that to then in the upper room. The altar that was used in the upper room was one that was used for holocausts, so for a lamb, and that very much is a chewing experience.
Right.
If you are, I've never participated in sacrificing a live lamb,
right?
But I would imagine that is like very much a chewing experience, not unlike the original one that you note. So there is this direct line to that to the Last Supper, to the Eucharist.
And you see that in more visceral examples with William Wallace, when they would cut up his pieces of his body and put his leg on one side of the city of London and then his torso on the other side, and his other side obviously didn't eat him, but dismembering someone's body and putting it around the entry points into a city has that same symbolic continuity to it, right? Our city is bound together by the dismembered body parts of William Wallace, who was a sacrifice we had to consume.
And even stoning someone, Girard points it out, stoning is not something that if you're doing it with a group of people, that you can say you are the one who threw the stone that killed the person.
Right.
Similarly. So.
You can always say, I was the guy in the back, my rock landed nearby her, not on her.
Right.
And that's a terrible thing. But that's kind of what Jesus would do to deal with the collectivism, is he'd say, okay, well, kind of like, taking responsibility for the stone that's in your hand when you're a voter, taking responsibility for the stone that's in your hand when you're on a jury duty, and They're saying, hey, this guy, he had a suspended license. Let's put him in a cage where he could be assaulted. How's that sound? Is he guilty? And you're like, yeah, okay, get him in there. You threw a little stone. You didn't have to. I mean, the founders actually designed the jury system to judge the morality of the laws themselves, but you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to go along like a bystander and say, yeah, send him in an assault cage because he didn't have Caesar's license. Sure. Right. Now, does that mean you should disobey law? Absolutely not. I believe you should obey all the laws, but there's a difference between you obeying them and then you enforcing bad laws onto your neighbor.
Well, there's a couple interesting questions that come up from that, in various levels of granularity. If we're going from the more granular, going back to the existing situation that we're experiencing right now on June 5th, 2020, if the mob keeps rejecting the sacrifices that are given to them, what happens when the jury trial happens for these cops? If the mob rejects that sacrifice, if we, I don't even say the mob, just like we crucified Christ, if we are the mob, if we reject that, what happens then? Do people go after the jurors, right? Do people go after the judge? Where does that cycle of violence go? There's also the broader question. This is one I've been thinking about more and more recently is, I'm not sure how much, one thing I've heard some people throw around is that this concept that, again, big disclaimer, not a theologian, but this concept that, Christ was a political atheist, right? Rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's. And I think one thing that's left out of that conversation, and I know this is not necessarily what you're saying, but I think that this is something that we always have these conversations as us as citizens, right? And that's an important conversation to have because there's a lot of injustice that happens on the behalf of citizens, whether they're on juries or they're voters, or they're someone calling the cops on their neighbor who's selling lemonade, right? But there's also an obligation when someone fills the role as ruler too. Mm-hmm. Like, what obligation does that person have? And that's a conversation that's never had.
Right.
I think the only people that tend to have that conversation are people like the bloggers at the Josiahs. Because I think there is a different state that one is in when they are the ruler. Unfortunately, the way that mob rule of democracy works is anyone can be the ruler. So we don't even think of this idea of like there's a different status that somebody holds. There's a different role they hold when they are in the place of being a ruler. Right. We don't even like that word. I don't know. It's if I knew the answer to how we solve this problem, again, $1 trillion question.
Yeah, you're right. And democracy consecrates a state of undifferentiation, a state of undifferentiation as normal, right? So you have carnivals in the ancient world where everybody could let loose, lose their sense of identity, put on a mask. Slaves could be served by their masters. Orgies could take place. You dance around the campfire with a mask on. You don't know if you're dating, if you're dancing with the mayor's wife or the peasant girl, which is all kinds of conversations for trouble. If you take wait a second.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then you got a feast. Somebody brings Ritz crackers. The other guy brought lamb roast. And then the guy who brought Ritz crackers is over there eating up all the lamb roast. Say, wait a second. That's a state of undifferentiation. I don't like this. You should have brought more. So all these little things are allowed to let loose during a festival or a carnival like Saturnalia. And then it culminates in a sacrifice, culminates in electing a young person, parading them around as a king with adornments. They get the finest orgies. They get the finest food. They get the finest wine. They get a robe. They're paraded around the town. And then, boom, sacrifice for the god of Saturn. Thank you. Let's have a good year.
Right.
And we can't do that anymore. We try, we can't. But democracy, it tries to consecrate undifferentiation as a normal state of affairs. I mean, because of the public nature of public goods, right? You take money from everybody and it builds a sidewalk and it builds a common square in which white nationalist evil people can march. Right? You say, well, wait a second. Remember that argument? Well, I don't want to allow white nationalists to walk on a park that I paid for with my tax dollars. That's a crisis of undifferentiation. You see? That's the nature of public goods.
People are taught from a young age, too, that anyone can become the ruler. Anyone can run for public office. Anyone can be elected. There's no fundamental difference between the ruler and the ruled.
Right. And that's why you have this call for, well, let's it was popular on the far left, and it's becoming normalized now in conversation recently, which is let's just destroy and get rid of the police force immediately, completely, defund policing. That's what they're saying. And it's like, well, what, this is a crisis of undifferentiation when you have public monopolies that we're all bound up into to have to pay for, because people say, I don't want my money going to, putting knees on the back of someone's neck.
Right.
I want my money going to education, or I want my money going to NASA. I want my money going to whatever, libraries. I suggest that maybe we should do a sushi menu style government. Allow people to have a sushi menu. You pick a la carte what you'd like to have your money, like percentage have it allocated towards,
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting different proposals for like charter cities and different models of governance that might be implemented in new cities that are being founded all across the world, right? So the Charter Cities Institute is working on a number of new charter cities in Africa that might operate on something similar. I think we don't necessarily need to go that extreme in addressing this. I do think that what we need, though, is we need some sort of differentiation, right? At the end of the day. I have a family member who's a manager for a borough and was speaking about this recently. One of the major issues with police today is they're not paid particularly well in the worst area that they're in. The worse the area they're in, the worse they're paid. So you tend to get like the worst kinds of people coming out of the academy who end up working in the worst neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So that's just a recipe for disaster. Mm-hmm. But if you teach people that, anyone can do this role, it's going to come down to the lowest common denominator, unfortunately, in a lot of places. There are only so many jobs for people who want to be the police in the high-end neighborhood.
Right.
So if you differentiate by making it harder for someone to actually come into that role, actually, like entering the seminary is a hard thing to do, right? It's a very, very hard thing to do. It takes 7 years. Good programs don't admit a lot of people. Police academy should be the same way. And you're going to get a very different person coming out on the other side than you're getting right now.
Right.
But that's a conversation you can't have. Instead, it's just easier to say to defund the program entirely.
Well, briefly, I just wanted to get your story a little bit about, when I met you, you had an obvious interest in, understanding the, insights that we could glean from studying the life of Jesus and how we could use those to inform our notions of leadership in the private sector, in our businesses, in our lives. You had an interest in it, but I don't think you were a Christian at the time. But I saw recently you kind of mentioned publicly that you have discovered, a faith in Christ, which is great. And I just wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit, just to get your story there. It's always interesting to hear people's journeys.
Yeah, I was baptized as a toddler. So depending on your theological view on toddler and infant baptism, I was either a very bad Christian or I wasn't a Christian for many years. I grew away from that faith growing up. It was a milquetoast kind of Episcopalianism, and to the credit of my pastor growing up, when the Episcopalian Church, like if you want to talk about group politics and scapegoating, read about the decline of the American Episcopalian Church. When the Episcopalian Church blew up, my pastor took the congregation to in a more orthodox direction. But like many young people, I go off to college. I am exposed to new ideas. I never fully embraced any kind of atheism, but it was I'd say it was maybe like a milquetoast Gnosticism almost, that like Christianity and Judeo-Christian values in particular are a fantastic evolutionary institution for like preventing the decline of society, right? A lot of the stuff we're talking about right now, right? Like I think I could have easily had this conversation with you a couple of years ago, and much of what I've said I would have agreed with. I just wouldn't have said that there's actually like a metaphysical, like fundamental truth to all of this. And I, that allowed me for.
And there are millions of people, by the way, who are in what you just described, that camp. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. And you reached out to me, I think, because you saw I tweeted about this when I was confirmed a week ago, after many months of catechesis and many years of reading. And I told you, like, I didn't tweet about that to say, like, oh, look at me, look what I've discovered. I did it because I hope that there are other people who were in my shoes who could reach out to me and say, Zach, what you said, I identify with that. But I don't have the faith element, right? And that was the hardest thing for me for the longest time. I read C.S. Lewis. I read summaries of Aquinas. I think Aquinas is kind of like Ayn Rand, that no one actually reads Aquinas, but they read summaries of Aquinas. And the people who do actually read it tend to be weird. I read arguments for and against the existence of God, for and against the resurrection, all these things. What I always came back to was, like, there are compelling arguments on both sides, and fundamentally I would have to, like, make a leap of faith one way or the other, either the leap of faith against or the leap of faith to. And I wanted to make the leap of faith too, but I found myself in this weird place maybe about a year ago, particularly after I took St. Augustine as my patron saint, which I found, a lot of people do that because he's a really famous saint, but also St. Augustine's personal story was, he grew up with a Christian mother who tried to get him to come to the faith. This was before infant baptism was common, so he was not baptized. And he went through these years studying with, like, the Manichaeans, who were, like, kind of Gnostics, like Christian flavored Gnostics, lived out years in sin. If you've read his confessions, he talks at length about stealing an apple and how he stole it, and how he stole it because he wanted to do bad, because he wanted to sin, because he savored the idea that he was doing something wrong. Which we kind of laugh at that, like, oh, he stole an apple. But I think many people do that today. They push these bounds because it's like, oh, well, this is taboo. And like many young people, I had lived through some years of exploring these things, never going down certain paths, but viewing it's like, these moral restrictions that we've developed on certain norms. Well, those are evolutionary things, right? I think that we should respect a lot of those norms, and it'd be bad to go against them. So I was a traditionalist in that regard, right?
Mhm.
But not because there's something, like, inherent to them. It's like in Catholic practice, there's this idea of perfect versus imperfect contrition, right? Imperfect contrition is this idea that you're sorry for your sins because you don't want to go to hell. And combined with going to confession, that's considered sufficient for penance. But perfect contrition is that you are sorry for your sins because they offend God, and because you love God. And I would have scoffed at that idea, right? So anyway, I got to this place probably about a year ago where it's like, okay, I can construct arguments in either direction. As far as the resurrection goes, as far as the existence of God goes, I want to believe, but I just couldn't tell myself that I had faith, right? And I had a friend recently reach out to me who grew up as a secular Jew, and he said something very similar. He's like, I've been to the traditional Latin Mass. I think it's beautiful. I've read about the life of Christ. I've talked to rabbis who can't tell me why Christ isn't the Messiah. They just say he's not, but they can't tell me why he's not. But I can't believe in the resurrection. It's like, well, that's an important part. That's the most important part. What I told him was what I'd been told and what I did, and this is going to sound incredibly dissatisfying or unsatisfying to a lot of people. And I'm sorry if you're in that, if you find this unsatisfying, but if you do find it unsatisfying and you identify with what I'm saying, try it. I prayed. I reached out I started praying. Eventually a number of events just happened that I can only attribute to divine providence. A friend reached out to me and said, like, hey, Zach, there's actually a parish in your town you should go to that's run by this group of very holy priests that I go to their parish in Detroit. I started going. I thought I was overwhelmed with the beauty of it all. I started talking to the priest. And I'd say it was probably 6 or 7 months. Yeah, probably 6 or 7 months after I started doing those things that I would actually be able to tell you that I had faith. And I understand that this doesn't happen to a lot of people, but it was, I can tell you like down to the day and almost to the minute that I could say like, I'm making that leap.
You had a born again Catholic experience. There
Yes, I know, it's weird. I a good friend of mine is kind of like a Pentecostal type, and I've been talking to him kind of all about it. And it's like, yeah, I understand, especially for a lot of Catholics, this doesn't tend to be their experience. But I was praying the Rosary, and in doing that, and it was in a moment of like particular, you know, I don't want to say fear, but a particular, like I think I allowed my guards, the rationalistic guards I'd put up for so many years, I allowed them to come down. There's a Blaise Pascal, famous of Pascal's Wager, has a somewhat similar experience that you can read about, where he was reading scripture one evening and he claims that he just felt like immense fire, almost pain, but I wouldn't quite describe it as pain. It was something that I was. It felt like fire, but it felt like something that I felt good, like dross being burnt away, right? Like that's how people often describe the flames of purgatory. So yeah, I told my friend who was raised as a secular Jew, I told him, like, pray. You know, it might take months. It's going to feel awkward and clunky at first. It's going to feel insincere at first. That's totally fine. You're just trying to get into the habit of it. I think one of the things that Catholicism gets right is having almost mechanical prayers to allow people to develop that habit, whether that's the Rosary, the Our Father, the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I think that's really, really important for people to start with. Yeah, so that was the process for me, and yeah.
That's good. And so, how has that affected your life with your social, sphere and your friends, family, anything like that?
My mother is a Catholic apostate, but she was like surprisingly supportive, so it was good. My father was raised Baptist and actually still doesn't know about this, so that'll be a fun conversation at some point. But for going back to like what our conversation earlier, I found a odd sense of calmness, not in the sense of like, oh, like Zen or anything like that, but in the sense of like being anchored to something that I wasn't necessarily searching for. But I had this experience yesterday. I went to evening mass. I'm very fortunate to live close to my parish. If anything I say, by the way, to your listeners, you identify with, I'd encourage you to look up parish if you have an apostolate for the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest in your town or your neighborhood. They're a great order of secular priests who were very, very helpful to me, and I'm very fortunate and blessed to have one of their apostolates very nearby, about an 8-minute drive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's given me. I was sitting in evening mass last night, and I just thought to myself, I'm like, this is a weird sense of like groundedness that I have not experienced, probably in the last 15, 20 years, if ever. It's difficult to explain. It's a process. I think what fundamentally if you want to dig into the theology, there's like 15,000 different Protestant sects. So I don't want to lump them all together when I say Protestants believe this about justification and Catholics believe this. But Catholic justification and Protestant justification are somewhat different. So you mentioned this idea of like born again, right? Which is like a very the way that my priest described it is, often you'll have in a lot of Protestant sects this idea that in that moment of being born again, you are then justified. So the snow falls on this corpse that was spiritually dead, right? Whereas in the Catholic doctrine of justification, it's more like this corpse is renewed continually through life. It's almost Aristotelian in the sense of like Aristotle talks about we can never say through someone's life that they've actually flourished until after they're dead, right? So it's this constant process. It's this constant process of trying to develop that habit of prayer, trying to develop that habit of virtue, and trying to root out some deeply ingrained sins and habits that I developed over 20-something years. So it's the beginning of what I hope will be many many years, right?
Now, to land the plane, I want to tie it back to your vocation. 1517. So you're a Catholic working for a 1517 nautical group. That's
Yeah.
God's humor, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, I was at a men's night in September for the parish that I ended up joining, and I'd only known one of the priests at this point, and I was meeting a lot of the guys for the first time, and we were all standing around, having a beer or whatever. And one of them asks me, "So, like, what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, well, I work in tech investing." And they're like, "So, like, what kind?" I'm like, "Oh, venture capital firm." Well, what's the name of the firm? 1517 Fund. And like, this is a very Orthodox parish, so like everyone gets very quiet and they kind of look at me, and I'm like, it's an analogy. It's an analogy, I swear. Like, tech people like the Reformation analogy. So, yeah.
But I was thinking of when the apostles see Jesus in his ascension, right? And then there's this statement to them: "Why are you looking in the sky? Get to work. Go and baptize all the nations." Right? And there's a vocational element to this idea. And I think about the fishes and loaves as being kind of a metaphor or a prophetic picture of what we who want to be in the imitation of Jesus should be up to, which is to take resources and to feed the hungry, and to do that in multiple ways. You can do it through charitable acts of free giving and unconditional renunciation of your wealth into charity, or you can do it through the investment and creation of new ideas, new technologies, and there's all kinds of other ways. Being a wonderful trade craftsman and different things like that. But as Peter Thiel and N.T. Wright and many people have said, the Bible begins in a garden, it ends in a city, right? And there's a trajectory to history that is I think is pro technology in a Christian sense. So how do you see your vocation? Your group looks for radically new technologies that can make people's lives better and provide a profit for those who bet on those technologies and get involved as stakeholders. How do you see that in light of your newfound faith?
That's a good question, and I don't have a fully formulated answer to it yet. What I can say is I've recently been discussing with people. There's this idea that Rod Dreher has. He's an author at the American Conservative of the Benedict Option. And I don't have a feeling one way or the other on his idea of the Benedict Option. It's essentially this idea that, if you look at Saint Benedict and the monks that he helped, establish, they were able to work as like this bulwark through the Dark Ages, right? By kind of withdrawing and being in this place and preserving this knowledge. And I think there's, again, I'm not endorsing his actual thesis one way or the other. I do think that, especially in light of like the riots, the woke culture, the politicization of everything, as people search for, some sacrifice that will actually appease them. I think there is this interesting case to be made that for like techno-Christianity, that we've been endowed with reason for a reason, and that reason allows us to go forth and multiply, to preach unto all the nations, and I think there is a role for preserving and advancing technology outside of the politicized institutions today, outside of academia, outside of the U.S. government. And people can say like, oh well, the church is a politicized institution. It's like, yeah, but if you look at a lot of monasteries and religious orders throughout history, they themselves are political institutions of a certain kind, but they do tend to be pretty separate. They do tend to be fairly insulated from like the waves of the day. I think there's an interesting case to be made for a new, whether it's a lay order or religious order of people who are charged with advancing technology for good, right? Separate from multinational corporations. And I'm not, I don't throw that just as a slur. Like, I think something we learned last year is that just as a function of market sizing, a lot of multinational corporations will happily parrot the Chinese Communist Party line if that's what allows them access to 1.4 billion people as a market size. So there's a place for finding and advancing that technology in different realms, right? So Pope Francis, his real first encyclical, there was an encyclical that came out shortly after he became Pope, but it was previously prepared under Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Francis's big first encyclical is an encyclical called Laudato Si, and it talks about the role of preserving the environment and conservationism. And I think there's a case that you could read that very easily, and you could say, well, that's the case for people who, if you're a great nuclear engineer and you're a Christian, you should absolutely be advancing like nuclear energy. Or if you're an engineer who's capable of developing a way for recapturing carbon, right? There's a religious vocation for you to preserve the world that has been given to us, and also to advance human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's something there. I'm planning on fleshing this idea out further, but it's one that I've been mulling on.
Yeah, I think that's very good. So I think Jesus spent his ministry healing people of illnesses. I think we need to cure these illnesses using our inspiration of Jesus as our motivation, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think also healing the planet. Yeah,
whatever charism you've been given. If you've been given this charism of knowledge, scientific knowledge like that, then yeah, you should use it that way.
Zak Slayback, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and great discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.